Hello, I'm Mark Siegrist sitting in for Dan Jones. It's been another busy week in Wisconsin politics. New district lines revive old battle lines. Recall voting is officially underway. Rick Horowitz, by the way, perceives a contradiction at the polls. More on that later. Also, some thoughts on powerful Milwaukee names of the past and just how good is that new Brewers bullpen. But first, let's say hello to members of our panel. Gerard Randall is a consultant and local job creation expert. Joel McNally is a Milwaukee-based newspaper columnist. Kevin Fischer, of course, a veteran broadcaster, writer, and frequent host on News Talk 1130 WISN. Topic number one now. Wisconsin Democratic lawmakers are crying foul over the GOP's redistricting maps. Majority Republicans are being accused of carving out new legislative and congressional lines in favor of their own political future, so they say. Are state Democrats talking rhetoric here on this one or raising legitimate concerns? Kevin, help us with this.
Well, the party that's drawing the lines, the Republicans, and they are drawing the lines because they hold all the power, because they won the elections last November. They are under no legal obligation to keep the districts the way they are, to change them dramatically, or to make them competitive between the two major parties.
Or to be fair.
Well, they have to follow the census tracts. They have to follow population, and there always are going to be some changes. And there are. 2 maps were approved today by a state Senate committee. Legislature will approve maps or a map next week. I believe one of the maps makes no changes to the congressional districts, very minor changes to 2 state assembly districts, and there are some hefty changes amongst the state Senate districts. None of this, if it does wind up in court, and I believe it will because these days that's the Democrat way, it's not enough to get them tossed out. And it's so much crying foul and stomping your feet when we know, if we're really honest here, if the tables were reversed, the Democrats would be drawing the lines just the way they wanted to.
Are both sides doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing on this issue, Joel?
I don't know about supposed to be doing. They're doing exactly what you expect politicians to do. Incumbents protect themselves above all. And it's really interesting at this time in this state's political history because we do have these recalls coming up, August 9th, where there's a very good chance the state Senate will be reversed from Republican control to Democratic control. That means that, you know, senators that were elected by past voters are going to be thrown out of office. And they're going to have new representatives elected by the current voters. The interesting thing about it is this map by the Republicans is intentionally drawn so that, for instance, if Alberta Darling gets beat by Sandy Pash, which there's a good chance she might be, in 2012 she can actually run in a brand new district where Sandy's voters are kicked out of the district and she gets a lot more right-wing Republican voters. You know, it's basically going to undo what the voters are getting ready to do this summer. So, yeah, you can say, yeah, that's what we expect politicians to do, to be unfair and to take advantage, But this is really, the idea of democracy is supposed to be that voters choose their representatives. It's not supposed to be that elected representatives choose their own voters. And that's exactly what's going on here. And it looks corrupt, it looks foul, and because it is corrupt and foul, I'm not saying that the other party wouldn't have done it too, but it is corrupt, it is foul, and it's anti-democratic.
But it's required by law every 10 years.
It's against democracy. You don't have to change it by law to throw voters out of a district who you think are going to vote against you and get a lot more, voters in that will.
You have to follow the population shifts.
But Gerard, as Kevin pointed out, will this hold up in court if it goes to court?
I think so. One of the elements in all of this, as they were crafting these districts, they took a look at the percentage of voting age members who were African American in those districts and who were also Hispanic. And the African American districts, many of them had dropped below 60%. Some, in fact, had dropped below 50%, and they were able to move 5 of those districts that were representing African Americans, African American majorities, moved them up to above 60% in each of those 5 districts. Judge Fred Kessler is odd man out in that scenario because he was moved outside of his district. And so naturally, from a personal standpoint, he's calling foul, even though there's a pickup of 1 additional seat for African Americans in the Assembly. On the Senate side, they took a look, and what you have are Madison representatives in the Senate and Milwaukee representatives in the Senate. They all have very safe seats. They probably would have had safe seats just by party representation and who they represent, that tend to vote traditionally for them regardless. I think this may have played out differently if one house or the governor's office had been controlled by a different party. And there would have been, then the courts, it would have ended up in the courts.
Or they could have had a compromise between the parties. Here's what the real danger of this is. By making a lot more safe seats, and I'm talking about safe Republican seats and safe Democratic seats, that means there is no incentive to compromise as a politician with the other party, because you can't possibly be thrown out of office. That's what has made politics in recent years so negative, so, kill the other guy and don't compromise and never, come to any kind of agreement. If you have both Republicans and Democrats in your district, you can't be as extreme and as right-wing or as left-wing as if in fact you have such a safe district, you can be as foul as you want and nobody's ever going to get rid of you, and we've seen too much of that.
I think there's the potential for
Or the flip side is you have an impasse all the time.
Let's move on to our next topic. Electoral changes are in the works for Wisconsin that go beyond redrawing district lines. The heart of the matter is who gets to cast a vote. Our friend Rick Horowitz thinks he sees a bit of contradiction between those future requirements and some current behavior. Rick?
There's nothing I admire more or see less than politicians acting on principle. Unless, of course, the principle is self-preservation. Take this past Tuesday, for instance. Tuesday was recall voting day where I live, so I scooted over to the middle school to do my part. The nice lady behind the desk wants my signature in a big logbook. I give her my signature. She also wonders if I have an ID card I can show her. She's only asking. She's not demanding, and she's certainly not requiring. Requiring starts next year. Next year is when the new rules really start to pile up. Only certain kinds of ID cards will be valid. Residency requirements will be more than doubled, and you'll need more documentation. Early voting, you'll have a smaller window. Those kinds of new rules. Now, some suspicious types, I'm not naming names, but some suspicious types have noticed that the kinds of people most likely to be shut out by the new rules, college students, renters, first-time voters, poor people, young people, tend to vote more for Democrats, when they're allowed to vote, that is. That never even crossed our minds, the Republicans who wrote the new rules insist. The rules, they say, are there to serve one purpose, and one purpose only, to protect the integrity of the voting process. Funny thing about Tuesday's voting process, though, there were 2 names on my ballot. One of them was the Democrat, Sandy Pash, who mounted the challenge to our Republican state senator, Alberta Darling, and the other name was a fake. I mean, she's a real person, but she's not a real Democrat. She's a Republican. She's one of the 6 fake Democrats Republican Party leaders put on ballots all around the state to force an extra round of sham elections, to delay the general election, to give vulnerable incumbents another month to raise big bucks in a campaign, to hope that the anger goes away. So, the mere possibility of an ineligible voter sneaking into the voting booth apparently keeps Republicans up at night. But the reality of fraudulent candidates actually on the ballot? No problem, if it helps the Republicans hang on to power. Tell me again about that integrity thing.
Thank you, Rick. You raised some interesting points. Now, let's get some feedback from colleagues on the panel about last Tuesday's recall primary. Gerard, any surprises in the way you see it?
None. Voter turnout was higher than expected. And in one of the races, it turned out there was a closer margin than was expected. But in reality, the effort was to have a primary so that Republicans and now even Democrats who have primaries will have more time in order to go out and convince voters that
the strategy worked,
that they should be supported. Exactly, the strategy worked, and I don't have a problem with that, because I do have a problem with the fact that these recalls, the recall process was abused.
Joel, how do you see it?
Well, I think the turnout was a major surprise. I mean, look at this. It was a phony primary to start with. I mean, there were only Democratic candidates and these fake Democrats, these Republicans. So here it is, an off season and a primary that's not even really a primary. And in Glendale, Alberta Darling's district, voters stood in line for an hour to vote. You know, and you know, all the predictors were saying, you know, we can't even say who's going to vote because probably nobody will vote. No, this shows, you know, the eagerness to vote in this recall. The August 9th election is going to be a really big turnout by motivated people who really are very upset. And we saw the other day, there was a poll that came out and said 59% of residents of Wisconsin now think Scott Walker is doing a terrible job, and the Republicans in control of the legislature are doing a terrible job. That this legislature has been so extreme that they have whipped people up in this state to want to turn out and get rid of them and change what's going on. And I think that was a major, major thing.
Kevin, what's your take on how Tuesday went down?
I agree with Gerard. There were no surprises and none were expected. This is the way I think we thought it was going to go. Personally, I didn't like the idea of that strategy of putting people in who said they were one party, but everybody in the state
It was a lie.
They were not. Well, but you know, the Democrats thought about doing the same thing a couple of years ago. You've got the same thing happening next week. I don't like it, but it did work. It gave some of the Republican candidates who are in power and had been working on the budget and other issues. That took them away from the campaign trail. Now they have more time to knock on doors, raise money, et cetera. Personally, I agree. Again, you said the recall process has been abused. I wholeheartedly agree. And it's been spurred by frustrated Democrats who didn't get their way last November. And now, instead of running better candidates and running better campaigns, have decided, well, we're just going to recall you because we didn't like the way you voted on a really tough issue. There are about a dozen or so states around the country that have very specific, limited, restricted reasons why you can recall a candidate. Malfeasance and graft and committing certain crimes. I think Wisconsin should dramatically reform its recall process so that you cannot just say, well, we didn't like the way you voted on the contracts. So we didn't like the way you voted on the state budget. We're going to toss you out.
Expressing themselves. These are voters. Remember, when these people got elected to office, they didn't say they were going to destroy, 50 years of rights.
They didn't.
They're not rights.
They were going to take the vote away from
They're
people.
not rights.
No one has a right to collective bargaining.
They ran.
Nowhere is that written that you have a
on
right to collective
jobs, and instead now they're killing jobs all across the state.
No, that's not true.
They're laying off teachers. They're laying off others. So what the voters are doing is exercising their right to say, this isn't what you ran on. We didn't elect you to do this stuff, so we want to get rid of you.
Actually, a lot of people did elect them to do
they have the right to do it.
And that right can be exercised every 2 years or 4 years.
Yeah. Correct.
You can have a total changeover in the assembly.
4 years.
You got to wait 2 years to change the whole assembly.
For Jim Doyle.
And in the Senate, every 2 years you have a chance to affect the majority in the Senate.
Let me tell you one thing you guys left out. The real reason for those fake candidates and those fake primaries didn't have anything to do with campaigning. It had to do with Republicans wanting another month to raise big bucks, and Alberta Darling has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars because she was chairman of the Joint Finance Committee, and people who wanted to get things put in the budget gave her hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the other thing was to hold on to power for one more month so they could pass this redistricting, which would then give them control of the legislature for the next 10 years. That was the real reason.
Well, since we're talking money, there's a national group called Act Blue, which has raised over $560,000 for the Democrats who are running in the recall elections in the states. Now, if they win, these state senators, if they win, are they going to be beholden to the people that voted them in, or to the out-of-state donors that gave $560,000?
A lot of those are in-state
dollars. That's a conundrum. That's a conundrum.
Let's move on now to topic number 3. By now, you've heard the tragic and shocking story involving retired Milwaukee business executive Charles McNally and his wife Ann. Without going into details, he's accused of trying to take her life. She's expected to recover from her injuries. Now, Charles McNally is 85 years of age, apparently in failing health, and being evaluated for mental competency in connection with the case. Now, the real reason I bring this up is merely that during the prime of his career, he was among the most powerful leaders in Milwaukee. McNally and his civic peers had a reputation for getting things done, whether major building projects or community initiatives. Joe, you knew this group well. Names like Meyer and names like O'Donnell, Ben Barkin. This was a powerful group of leaders in our community.
Yeah, and really there's nothing like them on the map today, because they were homegrown, they were part of this community, and they built this community. They built all the major institutions you can see with your naked eyes that are in this town, whether it's Performing Arts Center or 2 stadiums or whatever else. And they were very good at the physical structure. Once they got done building physical structure, they didn't know how quite to deal with things like education and quality of education and that kind of thing. But they were very good at building things, and their only real reason for being was to do those things. You know, they weren't out for personal glory so much. They wanted Milwaukee to be a major city, and they built it into a major city. A handful of people, really, and that was very impressive. Like I said, these days, unfortunately, so much of the leadership of the major corporations is out of town, and the ownership of the banks and the ownership of major companies has now left Milwaukee, and they just don't have that same commitment.
Kevin, I always sensed that when we had the opportunity to cover these leaders, that there was a certain rush that went with the group as a whole in terms of, we got an issue here, we're going to get it done. I mean, I always kind of sensed that. And again, with all due respect to the so-called leaders of today, they lack the passion, the desire, the pizzazz, the personality, the willingness to be upfront on these issues, like a Charles McNally, who you always went to when you wanted insight on the business outlook or the outlook on the economy. A Mayor Meyer, who may have been a crusty curmudgeon, but my oh my, if he wasn't the best mayor in the country, I don't know who was. People like Harold Breyer, who had his warts, but boy, did he run a scandal-free police department. And you could go on and on and on. And they were not lackluster, like I think the leaders of today are. They were out front, pushed an issue, knew what they wanted, and knew how to get it done. And yes, they did get it done. They weren't just, rhetoric. Empty rhetoric. They got stuff done. Pose this question here is because Kevin and Joel covered this group of leaders on a daily basis. Meanwhile, you were an insider to this group. You know these guys well enough to pick up the phone and communicate with them in terms of general business and community vision. What was that like? And
that may have been one of the shortcomings of the group, especially if you look at the successor organization, which is the Greater Milwaukee Committee. One, it was bricks and mortar focused. They didn't carry the same passion into addressing social concerns. You couldn't talk about economic parity or addressing the economic gap. There were efforts from time to time to address some of those things, but they oftentimes didn't meet with the same level of success that you could have with dealing with, say, some of the bricks and mortar issues.
And why
like
was that,
building a
Gerard?
stadium.
Why was that phase of the community so difficult to address?
I think because these are difficult problems to tackle, and you have to have a broader group of people in the room advising on these decisions, helping to make them.
That is an excellent point, because in fact, yes, it was white, male, wealthy. And they were used to getting their way. I mean, that's why they accomplished many of the things they accomplished. They were used to that. But they didn't understand the social issues. They really didn't. I mean, they didn't realize that there was a whole new generation of leaders coming up in the black community that were being shut out by them. By the white, wealthy suburban leadership. And if you don't nurture that kind of leadership in the community, it was going to come a time when these institutions were bought by all the out-of-town corporations and all the out-of-town banks, and the homegrown industries and the entrepreneurs who would have come up and taken over leadership had been stifled, had been kept down, and things like education were allowed to deteriorate, employment, local employment. I mean, they just didn't even understand those issues. It wasn't part of their vocabulary.
We did have some African Americans who were in the room at the time,
especially under Henry Meyer,
and not just on the corporate side. You had the Burgess Culberts of the world, the S.E. White Laws, the Geneva Johnsons. That were in the room, and they were pushing to affect change. I think we now have a new group of leaders that are in some of those rooms, but they don't have the same level of juice. A Chuck Harvey, for example, is someone that does have the heft, who is in the corporate rooms. A John Daniels is in the corporate rooms, but there's certainly not enough of them to make the same kind of difference on some of these issues that we would like to see.
And some of that old guard that we talked about, even though they were like bulls in a china shop, they still were consensus builders in their own way, and found a way to get things done, where today's political landscape, there is just too much sourness.
Which was amazing, Kevin, because they were all type A's. But when it came to building something...
Do we have time for me to tell a quick story or no?
Please.
Very quick. I have to tell this since you're here.
Okay.
Joel and Mark, that Henry Meyer had this disdain for the afternoon newspaper.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Oh, big time. And he'd call us to news conferences. It seemed almost daily during that whole sewer situation.
Right.
And Charlie Sykes, who was writing for the paper at the time, asked Henry Meyer a very pointed, direct question. And Henry Meyer said, "I'm not going to answer any question from any representative from that newspaper."
No, I think it was the GD newspaper.
Yeah. And then, without hesitation, Mark Siegrist, who was working for Channel 12, repeated the exact same question to Henry Meyer, who then, without hesitation, proceeded to answer the question.
You know what happened a few weeks later? I had to sit there for an hour and have a cup of Sanka with the mayor. And Harold Breyer would refer to that as sitting a man over and straightening him out. It was a different time, folks. Really, you had to experience it firsthand. All right, sports now. It's the top of the ninth at Miller Park. The Brewers are up by a run, and we need a stopper. Who gets the ball, John Axford or newly acquired New York Mets closer Francisco Rodriguez? Kevin, who do you give the ball to?
It depends on whether the next hitter is a lefty or a righty.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would like to believe that this isn't going to cause some friction. Mm-hmm. So far, the involved parties say no, everything's fine. K-Rod says he's glad to be here. But come on, these are professional athletes. Both of them want to be the guy in the ninth inning. I think it's a very good move. It came out of nowhere. It shored up a weakness. Anytime you can bring in another quality arm, that's good. That's good. Before the season started, the Brewers were 80-1 a chance in Vegas, the odds, to win the whole thing. Now, today, they are 15-1.
Wow.
I think they're still a player or two away, especially another arm, another bat, maybe a second baseman. There are other teams in the National League that are better than they are. They're going to have to win the division. They can't be a wild card. The wild card is going to come out of the East, either Philadelphia or Atlanta.
Yeah.
But I think the Brewers know this, and I think they're still wheeling and dealing. I think they're still going to make some other changes.
Gerard, was this the missing link?
No. I think erratic play has to to be addressed.
On the road.
I watched the game the other day,
On the road.
and the number of errors in that game was pitiful, especially the ones that came from the guy on our team that had just been selected as the all-star player of the game.
And it's been contagious. Is that because they're so tight as a unit?
I don't know if it's because they're tight as a unit. I think they now have to become very focused. This is the second half. I think they can get there. I do believe they can be in the series.
But you have to play 500 ball on the road.
Right.
They're not even close.
But, you know,
The road, Joel.
anyone who's going to find fault with Ricky Weeks as second base is crazy. This has been a great year
I'm
for
nuts.
Ricky Weeks. It's been a great year. You know, we could use a new shortstop. Don't get me wrong there. K-Rod and Axford, that will work perfectly. Axford has been through this before. He went with Trevor Hoffman, allowing Trevor Hoffman to have his day in the sun. At the time when Axford was coming up and really should have been the full-time closer, but they worked together very well. There's a contract thing, too, with K-Rod where they can't allow him to close 21 games, or they're going to owe him $17.5 million next year.
That won't happen.
That is not going to happen.
If it does, somebody loses their job.
K-Rod and Axford will work it out. We've got you're right, Kevin, the bullpen was a weakness.
Yep.
That's been fixed. If we fix shortstop, it's clear sailing.
Guys, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for letting me sit in. Have
Mark,
a great
always
weekend,
great
okay?
to see you, my friend.
Take care, everybody.